Hello everybody and welcome back to this tutorial. And right now what we're going to do is, as I said, we will continue with our sockets. We're going to focus mostly on blocking sockets, on socket timeouts, on defining some of the socket options, and so on and so on. Now what we did in the previous video is we took a look at some of the more detailed example of using send and receive functions and what they retrieve, the amount of bytes they retrieve, and we also tried to actually make our own while true loop, which is going to basically receive the exact amount of data that it is being sent, but for some reason it didn't want to work. Now I have a good idea why, and we'll get back to that once we actually encounter the JSON library within the socket programming. But for now on, let us focus on the timeouts in sockets. So basically, first of all, open up your idle, and I will simply just show you the usage of those functions that we have in socket library. So first of all, import socket library, and most socket operations will block indefinitely. Now you basically, if you want to, you can get an optional timeout. So first of all, if you create a socket that is going to be equal to socket.socket and it's going to be equal to socket.af_inet, which is our usual socket, and it's going to have the socket.sock stream for the TCP connection. In order to set a timeout, which is an optional timeout, you can use the function called setTimeout. In order to do that, you simply just call your socket descriptor and basically set the timeout function. So set timeout, and in between the brackets you will specify the amount of seconds that you want the socket to be timeouted. So let's say we specify 5.0 seconds or 5 seconds. Press here enter, and basically what this means is that, let's say you have a connection established already. We will not establish it one more time because we don't want to waste time doing that, but let us get into more details what this will do. So if you had a connection established, and let's say you call this socket to be set timeout for 5 seconds, and that means that if you get an s.receive function right after it, so let's say right after it there goes the s.receive, which wants to receive 1000 bytes, it will get a timeout exception error. It will say basically socket.timeout, and it will say the error is timed out. Now if you want to actually enable this, you can simply just remove the socket timeout for a specific reason or whatever your needs are by setting the timeout to be equal to none. So basically set timeout, you simply just call the same function that you called in the previous example, and you simply just specify none in the brackets, and that therefore it will actually remove the timeout and you will no longer have it. Okay, now you can also use non-blocking sockets. What their use is instead of timeouts you can use them. So the non-blocking sockets, you can set them simply just by calling the set blocking function. So in order to do that, you can simply just type s.setBlocking, and let's say you want to set that to be equal to false. You would simply do that just by specifying the set blocking and false in the brackets. What this means that the future send and receive functions that you call right after this statement right here will raise an exception if the operation was blocked. Okay, so it will simply just say if you try to s.receive once again, it will tell you resource temporarily unavailable. But as soon as you disable it, you can simply just call s.receive once again, and the data will be received, and therefore you can use it. Now these non-blocking sockets are sometimes used for polling. Okay, so another thing that we should briefly take a look at is the socket options. Now what socket options allow us to do is to specify something that we might need for our own use. So basically sockets have a large number of parameters. They can be set using the s dot, or it doesn't have to be s, you can whatever your s object is called. So s dot set sock opt is basically the function that will set socket objects, options, and in between the brackets you will specify the options. So let's see an example of setting socket options to reuse the port number. You would simply do that just by specifying set socket opt, and in between the brackets you specify socket.sol, sol underscore socket, everything capital, comma, socket.so underscore reuse addr, comma, 1. Press your enter, and right after it you would be able to call the bind function as we did in the previous examples. Basically this is an example of reusing the port number. Now you can basically go to the default Python page and take a look at the socket to see all of the available socket options that you have in this library. So these are not the only ones, these are just some of the ones that are almost always used, but you don't really need to use them. As you saw in the previous tutorial, we didn't really use them, but if you encounter this function, it will most likely be this specified in between the brackets. So once again, this is a function that sets timeout, this is a function that sets blocking, this is a function that sets socket options. Now another thing that you might want to consider is basically that you can use sockets as files if you want to. Maybe sometimes it is easier to work with sockets represented as a file object, and you can simply just do that by specifying file descriptor. For example, let's say we call it f, and you simply just specify f to be equal to s.makefile. It will make a file out of your socket object, and therefore you can use the socket object from now on as the same way you use the actual file. So for example, f.read is a function you can use. Now it will say right here, an error, a request to send or receive data was disallowed because the socket is not connected. Of course, we're not connecting, but you can use the same functions that you used in the actual file manipulation. So you also have f.read lines, you have f.write, you have f.write lines, which is a function that we didn't even see before. In the actual file creation, you have f.close as well as s.close in the socket library. Basically, all of the same functions that you used in files, you can now use on sockets as well. Now, basically, it is easy to write programs that will mysteriously freeze up or don't operate quite like you would expect if you use these sockets as files. So it is a little bit tricky. It has a tricky resource management. It must be managed, both the socket and the file, independently. So keep an eye on that. That is also something that you should basically take a look at. And also what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to take a look at creating the server and client using the UDP protocol. So what we did in the previous tutorials is we always use the socket.sock stream, which stands for the connection oriented program, or basically using the three-way handshake over TCP. And what we're going to use in the next tutorial is the UDP. We're also going to take a look at the Unix domain sockets, the raw sockets, and all the other stuff as well. So hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope I see you in the next one, where we'll start off with coding UDP server. Hope I see you there, and take care. Bye.